I thought I would take up one of the themes that Sam had mentioned about economic inequality, and to talk about the gender dimensions of economic inequality. And as probably most of you aware, there's been quite an explosion of reports and books and studies and so forth about inequality in income or expenditure and wealth. And there on the first slide of 3, the report from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN, Inequality Matters, the one by UNDP, Humanity Divided, one by the Asian Development Bank, Inequality in Asia and the Pacific, one from Oxfam, some colleagues here I know from Oxfam, Even It Up, Time to End Extreme Inequality, from the ILO, a global labour report that focused a lot on wages and income inequality, and of course, as Sam has already mentioned, a global rock star economist Thomas Piketty with his book on capitalism in the 21st century. And these studies concentrate a lot on some particular dimensions and measures of inequality. So this is a slide about measuring inequality in income or expenditure and in wealth. These studies, most of them, they talk about measures of inter-household inequality, using Gini coefficients, or the share of the top 1%, or the ratio of the share of the bottom 10% to the top 10%, etc. Inequality is usually measured in income for OECD and Latin American countries, where the household surveys have data on income. But for developing Asian countries and sub-Saharan African countries, usually expenditure measures, because the household surveys don't have income data, they have expenditure data. And it's probably won't surprise you to learn that the inequality tends to be larger when it's measured in terms of income than when it's measured in terms of expenditure. Rich people are so rich, they don't need to spend all of their money, so they can accumulate assets with a lot of it. There's also been a rediscovery of looking at inequality between factors of production, looking at the share of labour income in GDP and the share of capital income in GDP, as something that us oldsters remember from the 60s and 70s, but which has rather dropped out of sight for measures that really just look at the inequality between households. Of course, it's complicated to interpret or to measure this when there's a high prevalence of self-employment and small businesses that complicate the attribution of income to factors of production, and you have to make some decision. All businesses below that don't have any employees, it's just a sole person, let's count them as labour income, or any business that only has one or two people, let's count them as labour income. But there's been a rediscovery of this. And looking at those first two, the inter-household inequality and the inequality between factors of production, the general picture emerging from these reports, as you'll probably be aware, is of rising inequality from the 80s onwards, really, in some cases from the 70s onwards. The trajectories differ a bit between countries, between continents. The extent to which there's always been a rise in inequality differs, but the general picture and the story that's now come to dominate is this story of rising inequality. And if you go back longer in history, as Piketty does, with data for a much smaller group of countries, then you get that picture of once there was very high inequality in the 19th century, and then it fell, and to a low level in the 40s and 50s, and then it's rising again. But of course, in that picture, one of the things that feminists have been concerned on is this golden age of low inequality in the 50s and the 60s was an era of highly patriarchal gender relations when women's economic rights were very constrained. So we certainly can't have a picture that contesting inequality should be taking us back to the 50s and the 60s. We have to try and put into the discussion of inequality, that recognition, which I've very, very rarely heard anybody who wasn't a feminist voice, that this period of low inequality between households and between factors of production was a period of high economic inequality between women and men. Finally, on this slide, I've got the measures of inter-individual inequality, inequality between people of different kinds, which can be measured in various ways: wage gaps, differential rates of unemployment, employment, precarious work, asset ownership, hours of unpaid care-related work. And a lot of you here in the specific kinds of research you've been doing, I think, will have looked at some of these kinds of measures. It is difficult to get income measures. Wage measures, yes, for some countries, for some groups of people, but actually measures that look at women's income from all sources compared with men's income from all sources is not published anywhere on a regular basis. And as you know, most published household survey data aggregates household income, and it's not set up to measure inequality within households. And that's something, again, which some of the research that I'm sure some of you will be presenting throws some light on. So I looked at all these reports and look and see how did they deal with gender, and also, though I'm not going to have time to go into it in any detail, with race, ethnicity and indigeneity. The DACE report includes disability and indigeneity, but not gender. The UNDP report has a separate chapter on gender inequality, particularly in the labour market, done by feminist economist Stephanie Seguino. The Oxfam report has mentions of gender inequality in employment and wealth and unpaid care work. The ADB report, the Asian Development Bank report, has a special chapter on gender equality in the labour market by Jan van der Molen, another feminist economist. And the ILO report does have a separate chapter on gender wage gaps and the motherhood wage penalty. Piketty, in my view, does not systematically include race, ethnicity, indigeneity or gender, although you can find scattered mentions in that huge, thick tome. So I wanted to raise 3 questions about gender and economic inequality that we might discuss. One is, has economic inequality between women and men also increased in line with this story about inequality between households or between capital and labour is increasing? We've now, of course, got a new emphasis on policies to reduce economic inequality, but can we identify a set of policies that can successfully address women's economic inequality without increasing inter-household economic inequality? Or are we identifying a group of policies that actually will narrow the gaps between well-off women and men, but will actually, in so doing, increase rather than reduce inequalities between households? And finally, the drivers of economic inequality. Does gender play a part in increasing or reducing economic inequality in terms of the explanatory frameworks? I'll say a little bit about the first of these questions, and I'll repose really the third question, because I think this is something which I haven't yet done all the work on, and I want to encourage everybody else to think about it as well and give me their ideas. So if you look at what Stephanie wrote in her chapter for the UNDP report, lots and lots of data problems, and so as she notes in that chapter, really her analysis confined to gender differences in these 4 variables: the employment to population ratios of the population 15 and older, the unemployment rates, wages, and the shares of females and males employed in the industrial sector as some kind of proxy for gender job segregation in a sector of the economy that tends in many countries to pay somewhat better wages to women. It doesn't, because it can't, through lack of data, examine gender differences in income and wealth. So these measures are only going to be able to capture certain dimensions of economic inequality between women and men. And she's trying to do a global report, so there's always a challenge in doing that because so many countries, the data that you might want aren't available. But in this country, the data that you might want on what is the overall gender gap in overall income between women and men is not published on a regular basis. We've only got it for 2010, I think, in a published form at the moment. The key conclusions from Stephanie's work for UNDP were, I think the headline was, the reduction of gender gaps in education has not been matched by a reduction of gender gaps in the labour market. And the only labour market indicator that she looked at that shows a narrowing of the global mean gender gap is the employment to population ratio. So the female to male employment to population ratio has risen, meaning that the gap in employment between men and women on as a global mean has reduced. But she signals that this may be due to levelling down rather than levelling up, because in 70% of the countries in which there has been a narrowing of this gender gap in employment to population ratios, male employment rates have fallen. So it's not necessarily that women's employment rates are coming up to those of men, but they're going up, but men's are falling from what they had already been, and that's why the gap is narrowed. And I think this signals a general issue one has to look at in looking at any of this data on gender gaps. If they narrow, is it because of levelling up, or is it because of levelling down? And in situations of economic crisis, depression, and so forth, you can get levelling down rather than levelling up. Asia is as a region is a bit different from the global mean. That was the only region that reduced the gender gap in unemployment rates. Otherwise, they were not reduced on a regional basis. Although, as we know, unemployment rates, what they mean in countries without a social protection system, may not be very much. So I don't think that's the most important indicator. Gender wage gap is only available for a much smaller group of countries. And what she notes there is there has been some progress in reducing the gender wage gap, but it's very slow. And in fast-growing Asian economies, where you might expect there to be faster progress, it's been very slow. So the South Korean gap is still very high, despite the highly educated female population in South Korea. And finally, she emphasizes the point that some of us, I think, had already been thinking about, like the defeminization of the industrial sector in many middle-income countries. And she said this holds in all regions except Africa. So insofar as it's in the industrial sector where the better-paying working-class jobs are, women's share of them has been falling. That could be a cause for concern. The Asian Development Bank takes up some of those similar themes, but it also highlights a couple of other things that I'd like to pick out. One is the issue of, quote, vulnerable employment. The ILO uses this category, and they put together own account workers and contributing family workers. And of course there's this, you can contest how far that's always vulnerable employment. But anyway, it's certainly work without social protection, and as a contributing family worker, you don't have the money in your own hands very often. So, the Asian Development Bank report looks at this as another indicator and identifies the overrepresentation of women in these types of jobs as an issue, and finds that it's particularly pronounced in those 4 countries. So I think that's another kind of indicator, which is another attempt to get at the quality of the employment, to get beyond the quantity of the employment, to look at the quality of the employment. But the ADB report also emphasizes differences in women's employment rates by class or by country. So in the first bullet point, the group of countries there, it's women from wealthier households are substantially less likely to be employed as compared with those from the lowest wealth households, something I'm sure many of you working on those regions will be well aware of. But it's not true of all countries. So in Cambodia, the Maldives and the Philippines, women from the wealthier households are more likely to be employed compared with women from the poorest households. So this is an attempt, if you like, to look at some intersections of class and gender by looking at the employment rates of women according to the, in this case, the wealth quintiles they were from. Similarly with education, the women with at least a secondary school education are substantially less likely to be employed when compared with women with no schooling in a group of countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, India, Indonesia, Nepal and Timor-Leste, whereas women in the Maldives and Philippines who have secondary schooling or beyond are more likely to be employed. And I think that's teasing out some issues about the differences between women, which we also need to bear in mind. What kind of policy recommendations does the ABD report come up with? It's a list that I wouldn't disagree with, but I was looking for what's missing. So boost the remunerative value and security of women's jobs. Enforce anti-discrimination measures, yes, but there's no mention in that report of minimum wage legislation or trade union organisation. And there is evidence, I think, from some Latin American countries of the positive impact of introducing or raising minimum wages on women's incomes, but you don't find that in the ADB report. Improve the compatibility of women's market work with childcare, provide publicly funded maternity leave and childcare. But there wasn't much discussion of the issue of women employing other women as domestic workers to take care of their children, and the issues of improving the rights and the income of paid domestic workers. And then a lot of policies about promoting enabling policies for women in the informal sector and implementing gender responsive social protection measures, none of which I would have any specific quarrel with, but what I missed from this whole discussion was any focus on policies to increase Labour's share of GDP. If we're getting more women into labour markets, but it's a time when Labour's share of income is falling, then maybe we also need to look at a broader set of policies which may not be specifically targeted to women, but which try to address how can we improve Labour's situation compared with capital. A brief reference to the Oxfam report, which highlights, I think, in a valuable way, the connection between wealth and political power, and which others don't do in the same way, and points out, of course, that it's men who are overwhelmingly represented at the top of income and wealth, especially wealth ladders, and women at the bottom. If you take into account, right, who goes to Davos, who is not in the NGO contingent, who is in the Fortune 500 companies, who is on these lists of the richest people in the world, they're mainly men. And they highlight the fact that these rich people also have are disproportionately represented in other positions of power, political power as well as economic. The Oxfam report, I was very pleased to note, does not call for more women to be admitted to the ranks of the rich and powerful as a solution to this. It argues a range of policies, but the one I liked and I highlight here is more effective taxation of the rich to fund public services for poor women. And that's something we've been arguing for in the Women's Budget Group in the UK, for instance. And it does highlight, perhaps more than the other reports do, the inequality in the unpaid work of caring for family and community as underpinning many of the inequalities that we see in paid work. And I know that's something that's going to be taken up in some of the workshops. So I think what I got from reading all of that stuff was, well, there are one or two indicators that can show a falling gender gap. One at a global level, the employment to population ratio. For some countries you can get indicators of the falling gender wage gap. But overall, you do not get a picture of reduction of women's inequality in the labour market of the kind that you might have expected when you look at the narrowing of the gaps in education. And these richest 1% and so forth who hold the political power, some women, but overwhelmingly men. So on to the kind of data we would like to have about looking at the overall income of men and women, or looking at income gaps within households, is just not there. There's a big data challenge there. So then, looking at the kind of policies that they were identifying and that I've heard other people discussing, posed to me the question, well, can policy successfully address women's economic inequality without increasing inter-household economic inequality? And this particularly came to mind because I was hearing more and more focus on, particularly in South Asia, these educated women who were not in the labour market. We have to identify this as a problem and we have to get more of these women in the labour market. IMF, I was at a workshop at the IMF. The IMF has now discovered gender because Madame Lagarde has instructed them to discover gender, and they're busy doing, reinventing the wheel, some of us might say, but looking at things like gender gaps in the labour force participation rates, and have identified, of course, what many people have known about for a long time, is the fact that if you educate women doesn't necessarily mean they're going to participate in the labour market. I would add, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get a decent living. So there was a lot of focus on increasing the employment rates and earnings of women who have completed secondary and tertiary education. And we mustn't let that education go to waste, and this will reduce gender gaps if we do that. Fair enough, but it's also, if that's the only policy, the major policy focus for reducing economic gaps between men and women, then that is likely, I think, to increase inter-household inequality, particularly if it goes along with the privatisation and marketisation of the provision and infrastructure of care services that reduce unpaid work, as that is likely to make the charges, introduction of charges and those charges to be unaffordable for low-income women. So I want to see if we could identify additional policies, or policies that we might argue for greater priority for, to improve the earnings and conditions of work of low-income women, particularly those who are already employed, including policies to increase minimum wages, employment guarantees, and supporting rather than demonising trade union organisation, and to ensure that the infrastructure and care services that low-income women need are publicly provided and financed by higher taxes on wealthy people and corporations. My final question was, does gender play a role in driving economic inequality? Now, none of the reports and the books that I've mentioned, in my view, discuss gender when they discuss drivers of economic inequality. As I've already said, none of them comment on the fact that this low inequality, economic inequality in the 50s and 60s was accompanied by strongly patriarchal forms of gender inequality, where in many countries women had to leave the labour market if they got married, or they could not take out a loan in their own right. the dynamics of capital accumulation are discussed in the reports that do focus on the dynamics of inequality without reference to social reproduction. So if you've ploughed your way through Piketty, I think his discussion of the drivers of inequality is all to do with whether the rate of return to the accumulation of assets is greater than the rate of economic growth. That's been subject to quite a lot of criticisms from different heterodox economists, and I find it a very mechanical way of understanding the dynamics of gender inequality, which makes no mention, for instance, of ups and downs or crises or the actual process of production and realization of profit. But it has nothing to say, I think, really about gender in this regard. It treats capital accumulation as a system which is not gendered or not racialized either, apart from a few sporadic comments. But if you look at the UNDP report, which looks at drivers of inequality in terms of globalization and in terms of fiscal policy, there's no mention of gender there either. And so I think that's a challenge for us all. And I don't have any answers to give you today, because that's something I'm still working on, and this is everybody's homework. Maybe you've already thought about it and can come up with some answers, but I think we need to look not only at looking at the data, what does the data show about the extent of different kinds of inequality, whether it's increased or decreased, but also what are the underlying dynamics that generate this rising inequality, and does gender relations play any role in that?